Improvisation, Iranian classical music and UK music pedagogy, a cross-cultural exploration. So I'm going to start with a bit of background about me and how the study came about. My name is Roxana Albayati. I'm a musician, born and raised in the UK, half Iranian, half Iraqi, first generation British. I'm a classically trained cellist, untrained experimental performer, teacher and improviser. Like many creatives, my professional identity is somewhat unclear. To make matters worse or more interesting, my personal identity is blurred as well. That is the opening of the paper, and from now on I'm just going to give you the condensed version of the rest. So, my music education had always been quite traditional and heavily notation-based, always geared to learning the notes and the technique. Once I got to higher education, I quickly was very involved in new music and performance art. Later on, during my masters, I started improvising a great deal, and this was mostly experimental solo improvisation. The topic of this study evolved from my musical journey, which actually resulted in a lack of interconnection between all these parts of my identity, and it really bothered me. So firstly, despite the majority of my time as a performer being occupied with experiments and original creativity, there wasn't really much of this in my teaching methods. Of course, I was imaginative, but it never quite matched the quality of this imagination which I had in my personal performance practice, and didn't really challenge my perspectives on traditional instrumental teaching. Secondly, when I would improvise, listeners often would say that they could hear how I was influenced by my heritage as music. But I'd never actually studied Iranian music, and I knew embarrassingly little about the music I was supposedly projecting. So, despite the listeners potentially exoticizing my playing, I became fascinated by studying Iranian music and specifically experiencing it as a student. Exploring my Iranian self as a musician was particularly appealing. My stable identity as a cellist seemed to provide a safe outlet for me to attempt to ground myself in my ethnic identity, which had so far really proved to be insecure. At this point, all I really knew was that Iranian classical music had a heavy oral tradition, and it prided improvisation at the core. It was really a completely foreign system to any of my own pedagogical experiences, but it was within a familiar culture where creativity was at the center. So it did seem that I had the potential to bind some of my identities, and the only way which this could be possible seemed to be through artography. So, what is artography? Artography is a qualitative, autoethnographic process which brings together the roles of an artist, a researcher, and a teacher through the process of a research methodology, creative practice, and performative pedagogy all simultaneously happening. Rather than specifically aiming at answers, artography really dwells on process, the in-between, the flexibility of interpretation, and entry and exit of the questions surrounding the research which is being carried out. And so, what does this mean for my study? Well, I investigated how my experience of learning the techniques and processes of Iranian classical music reshaped my understanding of pedagogical and personal practice. I specifically drew comparisons between Iranian classical music learning experiences, my cello teaching practice, and how improvisation played a part in both of these areas. Specifically, the interconnections between my roles as an improviser, a teacher, and a student became a particular focus. The study ran from February 2020 until December 2020. I had 10 pupils in total at the time, private pupils, and I used 6 of them for the purpose of analysis. All names were changed for the paper. I took weekly practical and theory lessons with the Iranian musicians Faraz Eshki and Davud Jafari, who are also my very good friends, and I'm very grateful for them. The topics which emerged for discussion were improvisation, ear playing, and Learnacy. So now, about Iranian music. Radif is the name of the Iranian music system. It literally means row or series, and it refers to approximately 270 gouchets. And these are short melodic models, let's call them. They're taught orally and memorized by musicians, and it gives them this sort of foundation to elaborate upon. Within the radif is the concept of dasgah. There are 12 dasgahs, and each one is simultaneously the name given to the group of gouchets being played during a performance, as well as the name of the main mode of the performance. Each gouchet and dasgah have general shape and structure, which is highly recognizable. But within them, there's a certain amount of improvisatory freedom. It gives the performer flexibility to elaborate upon, but within the identity of the music. As I've said, everything is traditionally taught orally, and this really defines the music system. As Farhad says, Persian music was never submitted to any kind of notation. Performing musicians had always absorbed through experience. That is why composition was never developed into an art separate from performance. It was an aspect of performance. Now, Lodan Nushin has defined the core concept of Iranian music as creative performance, which is essentially what Farhat is explaining to us. This form of creativity sees no distinction between a performer, a composer, or an improviser, and this is heavily grounded in the music tradition. However, what was ingrained in me, and possibly my students, were distinct barriers and functions between composers, performers, and improvisers. So, Iranian music and its pedagogy presented a system where the student is trained simultaneously as a performer and a composer, with the flexibility to interchange and experience these two musical identities at the same time. So I thought, hopefully, experiencing this approach could teach me how to reproduce a similar environment in my teaching practice, as well as redefine my understanding of these musical roles. Integrating Iranian music into my improvisation practice was initially quite difficult, and I really struggled with it for the first half of the study, at least. So I turned to Douglas Finch for advice. He was my improvisation tutor at the time when I did my master's at Trinity. And this was an email conversation we had. I said, integrating the Iranian music just feels too forced and fake. I definitely need to understand it more before I can integrate it naturally into my practice. Douglas, I don't think you need to worry about faking. Being Iranian is part of your identity. There's nothing fake about that. What would happen if you used Iranian music as a reference point, but used your subconscious more? So I understood his point as suggesting that successful improvisation is really more reliant on a state of mind than on a skill set. And he encouraged me to explore my subconscious expression rather than relying entirely on the rules of the unfamiliar music system. Seeking a mode of playing which is open, non-judgmental, detached, and alert. So, through experiencing learning as a new form of creativity, I really had to unpack my own mindset, and as a result, I felt ready to encourage a similar approach with my students. Before I'd done this, I had no idea how to approach the topic of improvisation with my students. I really feared they would misunderstand or dislike this aspect of music making, especially as it was so close to my heart. And during the study, I discovered the root. I'd never actually experienced being taught improvisation from a beginner stage. I began improvising only after 14 years of playing the cello, and by this point my personal form of expression came about without too much conscious effort. Now I found myself forced to being considered my approach to improv, and then as a result I felt quite ready to do the same for my students in a healthy manner. So let's take a look at Hannah. Hannah came to me just prior to the study, and she had a really vivid imagination, but she'd lost all enjoyment in playing her cello, and she was barely practicing. This really was bothering her and her mum, who talked to me about it before we started lessons, and she'd switched to me because her previous teacher didn't encourage creativity or really talk about this aspect of music. So I implemented improvisation quite heavily into our lessons, and she said this around halfway through the study. I really love improvisation. It's freeing and helps me explore the cello more. It's the reason to get my cello out and practice. I shared that final reason with her. So the exploring she was referring to is with regards to learning new techniques and finding new ways of playing the cello, both with my instruction and through her own initiative, I found. She was acting with a newfound confidence, which really was matching her curiosity. And Confield describes, mastering creativity is a process that does not involve education or even transmission as such, but rather active enculturation that leads musicians to take full agency over their development of their own creativity. And I found this full agency he refers to appearing in the majority of my pupils, and it was exactly what I intended. I am technically their cello teacher, but I really wanted them to discover their own voice through improvisation by themselves with my guidance. I'm now going to discuss ear playing. Ear playing was a really big part of my Iranian music lessons because it's all transmitted orally, without any notation or without much emphasis on the notation. Imitation was a really huge part of both the theory and the practical lessons. And I'd never really experienced ear playing techniques as a student before, and because of this I'd never used it with my own students. Prior to this study, I used ear playing only as a game to develop listening, and I never really emphasized the need for my students to imitate me perfectly. And it was exactly for this reason I never used ear playing to teach them pieces. I really feared that if students imitated incorrectly, they would learn incorrectly from the start, and it would make the whole learning process more challenging. So during the study, I experienced ear playing as a beginner, and I really struggled through the process. And here is a diary entry I have. Ear playing is tricky. Sometimes it's fine, and I pick it up quickly. Some impulses I have are already correct due to listening a lot. But when a piece or technique is hard or unfamiliar, it's tiring, especially when simultaneously looking at the music. This experience I was having is completely explainable, and Tim Palmer, who I think we all know well, has explained it quite logically. Many learners in the Western art music tradition struggle with connecting the ear to the movement of fingers and the reading of notation. A strong early focus on notational literacy can impede the development of an oral, embodied, and relational musical literacy. And this can only come through the suite of ear-playing activities centering on improvisation. So, after experiencing ear playing as a student, and understanding the reasons why I was struggling through it, I was really curious to use the method with my students to teach them Western classical repertoire. I began teaching completely by ear, using notation only as a secondary source, and I only introduced it until a few weeks after learning. This was probably the most radical change I made in my teaching practice. And here we have a conversation with Hannah, who I talked about previously. I said, "How do you feel when I then show you the music after having played by ear?" Hannah: "Sometimes it's confusing and I don't understand, but when I try to play it, it just sort of falls into place and then I get it, especially if you're not there when practicing at home. I need to read and play the music to see how it links to what I just played by ear." Now, what she's describing is exactly what Palmer just described to us, this inability or lack of physical understanding between the notation and our finger movements. This prompted me to ask, why exactly does notation hinder the development of musical literacy and oral abilities? Well, I believe it acts as a catalyst for fear-based learning. In Nachmanovich's beautiful book, Free Play, he compares the anxiety experienced by musicians to the 5 fears of Buddhism. He then adds his own potential 6th fear, the fear of ghosts, which he says represents the distress caused by authority figures such as teachers, parents, or great masters. So, let's understand the fear of ghosts in the context of a lesson. I think that the fear of ghosts would primarily be found in the student, where the ghosts are the teacher or the score. And as I discovered in my Iranian music lessons, even if the teacher is highly encouraging and limits remarks surrounding criticism, the notation still acts as the ultimate goal, and it seemingly needs to be played exactly as it's written. The potential for mistakes, unpleasant experiences, and anxiety doesn't allow the student to realise their full musical potential. As a result, the student may make many mistakes. They could play without character, or they might even be too nervous to play anything at all. But once notation is removed, or even not introduced in the first place, which I ended up doing, we could probably get rid of some of the focus on perfectionism and therefore removing the fear of ghosts. I saw this happening quite effectively with my student Eric. He started lessons with me in 2018 and at first had shown he was quite a quick learner and he quite quickly approached grade 2 level. But just before the study began, he dropped right back to beginner level because he started really struggling both at school and in our cello lessons. He'd been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which for him manifested as a weak attention span, extreme perfectionism, and anxiety. He would run out of the room having a panic attack, he would cry in lessons, and he just was really struggling and he couldn't explain why. His mum would be there during the lessons and she was just as clueless as he was. He rarely could explain why, but actually one day he said this to me: "If I make a mistake, then you, Roxana, won't be happy with my playing." This really affected me. I always thought I was a teacher who didn't place unhealthy attention on mistakes. If anything, I would unpack them and wanted to encourage them, to discuss them, teach my students how to maneuver around them realistically, because they're going to happen. What I thought was happening was Eric was transferring his fear of ghosts onto me. He, instead of fearing the notation, he was fearing my judgment, which really wasn't present. So for him, I totally eradicated all notation from his lessons and really heavily implemented improvisation and ear playing, of course. Then towards the end of the study, we had this conversation. How does it make you feel when I play something and you have to copy? Eric: you have to look for the sounds that you make. Sometimes I find it, sometimes it's hard to find, but it's getting easier because you can recognize them more. Me: if you get it wrong, what happens? Eric, jokingly: either I cry, or I guess I just try to continue with it. Now, this rational discussion and explanation was really a key moment for Eric. By the end of the study, Eric's general anxiety and anxiety related to perfectionism had decreased significantly, and I think it was due to such an intense implementation of improvisation and ear playing in his learning. His mum also agreed. Subsequently, his musical skills were able to grow without his fears intruding on him, and this is really outlined in this conversation, I think. Towards the end of the study, I actually reintroduced notation to Eric for the pieces we'd learned only by ear throughout the study. He admitted to finding the notation less scary, and he had a lot less anxiety surrounding reading the score. Once again, Palmer's theory that hearing, reading, and writing music can only truly develop through improvisation and oral-based activities proves to have taken effect. I'm really happy to say that Eric managed to work his way back up to grade 2 level during the study, and he's now stably approaching grade 3. The final topic was Learnacy. And Learnacy is the ability to learn. It was a concept first coined by Guy Claxton, and it's similar to literacy or numeracy as the abilities to read and write or work with numbers. Usually, Learnacy is discussed as something desirable in students, where the teacher is simply the one responsible to cultivate the attribute. But I would really argue that Learnacy is equally, if not more importantly, required by the teachers themselves. And Learnacy can't be developed in the students, let alone the teachers, if our teaching practices are led by fear-based learning or indeed fear-based teaching. Now, previously, I discussed my fears about using improvisation or ear playing too extensively, and I don't think I'm the only teacher who's avoided using certain techniques due to fear. If we look at Lucy Green's study, Music, Informal Learning and the School, there she integrated informal learning practices into the classroom setting, and she was really challenging the traditional role of the teacher. Just before the first sessions, the teachers were describing their emotions before they went into the classroom, and they used words such as dread and panic to explain how they felt. And one even said, "I'm terrified about the lesson today. I'm actually scared." These anxieties surrounding new teaching methods can all be pinned down to one concrete issue. The teachers have not experienced the learning methods themselves, which was exactly what I found during the study. I'd never experienced ear playing, and I'd never experienced being taught improvisation, which is why I was hesitant before the study to use these in my teaching practice. So, I propose a seventh fear to Nachmanovich's ever-growing list of fears, the fear of the unknown. If the teacher has not experienced the learning process themselves, they may not understand the logic or the struggles nor the success, allowing for mistrust between the teacher and the method. So during the study, I saw the fear of the unknown disappear firstly in myself, then my students, and it allowed Learnacy to develop for everyone involved. And I'm just going to jump to Hannah again for a quote. She was full of great quotes. I said, "What do you think about learning pieces by ear or copying what I play?" Hannah: "At first I found it scary, but now I know it's fine. Even if I don't get the notes the first time, I just need to really listen. And I'll get them. Your fingers know where the notes are. You just need to let them find their way. I still get a bit nervous, but not like before. Now I know it's okay not to be right the first time." Here, Hannah describes not only her journey during the study, but also mine and other students' journey to some extent. She understood her transition from experiencing to eliminating the fear of the unknown, valuing and trusting her skills. I found the majority of students arrived at this realization. Perhaps not everyone could articulate it and understand it as clearly as she did, but the progress was still quite evident. So, a final point. This study really did interrogate and challenge all of my identities, and as a result, I think it did strengthen the interconnectivity between all of them. But this process is by far no means over. When this study ended almost a year ago, I challenged myself to keep up the artographic research methodology, and I still am doing it, and I'm still learning lots, and I'm still making new conclusions every day. If I want to make one main point, though, for this study, I think the main thing to take away is the act of the teacher placing themselves as in the role of the student. Whether we want to go into depth about Learnacy or musical literacy, the roles of performer, improviser, composer, or the elimination of fears, I think the only reason I got into the depth of it was because I really embraced stepping into the role of the student and then taking what I'd learned back into my classroom. As a result, all of my students, or at least the majority of them, showed really promising results, and they all embraced my new teaching methods. By the end of the study, they were actually more fearless than I had become, and I really think the braver the teacher, the braver the student. Thank you for listening.